She is 44 years old now. She runs a direct-to-consumer seafood operation out of Knox County, Maine, that cleared $340,000 in gross revenue last year, with a buyer list of restaurants and private households spread across 11 states, and a waiting list she stopped managing personally because it had gotten too long to manage personally. She employs 4 people year-round and 2 more through the August run. She owns a 12,000-gallon recirculating aquaculture system she designed alongside a retired fisheries biologist from the University of Maine. A refrigerated Isuzu NPR box truck she uses for live haul delivery to her Portland accounts. And a holding facility that smells, in the words of one chef who visited it, like cold water and money. But on a Tuesday morning in October of 2011, Donna Ainsworth was standing at the end of a processing dock in Rockland, Maine, 41 years old, holding a clipboard, watching a man named Gideon Marsh look at a tank of juvenile striped bass with the expression a person uses when they are trying to find a polite way to say no. He found one, several, actually too small for commercial grading, he said. Under the pound-and-a-half dressed weight threshold his buyers required. The feed conversion ratio on growing them out further would eat any margin she thought she had. Striped bass had a reputation in the wholesale market, and that reputation was built on a specific size profile. A 2 to 3 pound fish, dressed, was what the supply chain was built around. Anything smaller was off-spec. Anything off-spec was her problem, not his. He wasn't wrong about any of it. He was wrong about what she was going to do with it. If you've ever been told your version of something wasn't the right version, too small, too different, too far from what everyone else was doing, this channel is for you. Hit subscribe before we go further. The rest of this matters. It was the last week of October 2011, which in Knox County, Maine means the tourist traffic has folded up for the season. The lobster boats have started scaling back their trap counts before winter, and the cold comes in off Penobscot Bay with a seriousness it doesn't carry in September. The light sits lower on the water by 4 o'clock, and the docks in Rockland empty out early. Gideon Marsh ran a mid-size seafood brokerage out of a low building at the end of one of those docks. He had been in the business for 22 years, knew every buyer between Portland and Boston worth knowing, and was generally regarded in Knox County as the kind of man whose opinion on fish prices you asked before you made a decision, not after. A dock worker named Pete Soucy, who had worked that particular dock since the Clinton administration, said later that he had never seen anyone leave a conversation with Gideon feeling better than when they arrived. He meant it as a compliment. Mostly, the tank itself was nothing dramatic to look at. A rectangular fiberglass holding tank, 1,200 gallons, borrowed space at the edge of Gideon's facility for the morning. The fish moved slowly in the cold water, dark-backed and silver-sided, crowding loosely at the aeration diffuser the way striped bass do when the oxygen is good. They were healthy fish. Anyone who knew fish could see that. What Gideon was looking at was not the fish. He was looking at the size. Donna had driven the 45 minutes from Thomaston that morning, with the particular focus of someone who has been building toward a conversation for 3 years. She had started her grow-out operation in the converted barn on her family's property in 2009. Not commercial scale, not what she was trying to get to. Just 2 5,000-gallon fiberglass tanks she'd bought used from a failed trout operation in Belknap County, New Hampshire, and a used oxygen monitoring system she had wired into the water intake herself after watching 17 instructional videos across 4 evenings. She had started with striped bass fingerlings, 3 to 5 inches, bought from a hatchery in Dorchester County, Maryland, because fingerlings were cheap in a way that stocker-size fish were not. A stocker-size striped bass, 8 to 10 inches, ready to grow to market weight in 12 to 14 months, cost $1. $85 to $2.40 per fish at that time, depending on source and order volume. A fingerling cost $0. 19. She had ordered 4,000 of them in the spring of 2009, lost roughly 400 to the adjustment period in the first 2 months, and spent 2.5 years growing the survivors on. The problem, which she had understood in principle and now understood in practice, was that a cohort of juvenile fish does not grow at a uniform rate. Even from the same hatch, the same tank conditions, the same twice-daily feeding regimen, striped bass will spread across a size distribution over time. The fast growers pull ahead. In a good grow-out operation, the fast growers represent the majority. In Donna's tanks, after 30 months, her best fish were sitting at 2 pounds dressed, or better. Exactly where Gideon's buyers wanted them. Those she could sell. But roughly 400 fish in the tank had lagged behind, 12 to 16 ounces dressed, healthy, fat, well-colored, eating well. Just smaller. In the language of the industry, grayed out. Undersized fraction. A category that commercial buyers like Gideon Marsh did not have a channel for and did not pretend to. He explained her options with the patient directness of someone who has given the same explanation before and expects it to land the same way. Hold the undersized fish and pay the daily feed cost, roughly $0. 14 per fish per day at her tank density while they grew to grade. Sell them at a deep discount to whatever secondary buyer might take undersized fish off her hands, or absorb them as a planned loss, which was the industry standard approach, and price her full-size fish to cover the write-off. Most small grow-out operators, he said, budgeted for 8 to 15% grade out as a fixed cost of doing business. Donna thanked him. She signed the paperwork on the full-size fish, which Gideon would broker to his Boston accounts at $4. 90 per pound wholesale. She drove home on Route 1 along the coast with the windows up against the October wind and thought about her father. Warren Ainsworth had farmed outside of Thomaston for 30 years on a mixed property, vegetables, pastured poultry, a small apple orchard on the south slope, and had sold almost nothing through conventional distribution channels, because conventional distribution channels had never worked particularly well for operations his size and shape. The volumes were too small and too irregular for the wholesale buyers, the product profiles too diverse for any single category buyer, the location too far from the aggregation points to make the logistics work without squeezing the margin to nothing. Warren had spent his whole farming career finding the buyers who wanted what he already had, rather than reshaping what he had to fit what buyers already existed. He was not famous for it, not prosperous in any visible way. He had paid his property taxes, kept his equipment running, and put 2 daughters through school without much drama, which in small-scale farming is not a small thing. He had a saying Donna had heard so many times it had gone quiet, the way repeated things go quiet. The market that doesn't want your product is the wrong market. The right market hasn't found you yet. She had heard it at the kitchen table, in the truck on the way to farmers' markets, in the barn when a crop had come in at the wrong time, or the wrong size for whoever she thought would buy it. She had heard it so often that by the time she left home for college, she had stopped registering it as information. It was just a thing her father said. Warren died in March of 2008, 1 week before his 67th birthday. He did not see the aquaculture operation. He had no idea she was going to build one. He had known, because he was the kind of person who paid close attention to the people around him, that his youngest daughter was going to find something that worked on her own terms, and that whatever it was, it probably wasn't going to look like what anyone expected when they first saw it. He had said something close to that at the kitchen table the last Christmas before he got sick, that he wasn't worried about her, that she had a way of seeing past the surface of a problem that most people didn't have, and she had told him he was being sentimental. He had said he probably was. She went back to Thomaston in the summer of 2008, 6 months after he died. She had been living in Portland, working in fisheries compliance for a state contractor. She came back for a weekend to help her mother with some things, and she walked the property on a Sunday morning. And she looked at the barn with its good concrete floor and its solid roof and its water line already run from the well, and she thought about the tanks she had been reading about for 2 years. She does not know, even now, whether the decision had anything to do with grief or whether it was purely practical. She has said she stopped trying to sort that out a long time ago. She ordered the Fingerlings in April of 2009. What she found on the drive back from Rockland in October of 2011 was that her father's logic applied directly and specifically to the 400 fish sitting in her tank. The wholesale striped bass market didn't want a 12 to 16 ounce fish. That was real. The requirements Gideon described were real requirements, built around real logistical needs, what a chef could portion for table service, what a distributor could grade and handle in volume, what a line cook could execute under pressure on a Friday night with 40 covers. Those requirements were not arbitrary. They were also not universal. They were the requirements of one market. They were not the requirements of all possible markets. A 12-ounce whole striped bass, drawn and scaled and packed in crushed ice, was a perfect single-serving fish for a home cook who wanted to roast it whole with herbs and lemon on a sheet pan. It was also, she realized slowly and then all at once, almost entirely unavailable in that form. The wholesale channel had written it off. The retail seafood counter didn't stock it because the wholesale channel didn't supply it. The consumer who might want it, the home cook, the weekend cook, the person who had eaten it whole at a restaurant in Maine on vacation and wanted to try it at home, had no way to find it, because no one had decided it was worth offering. She spent the rest of October and most of November making phone calls. Not to the white tablecloth establishments that ran their seafood purchasing through Cisco or U.S. Foods. Those were Gideon's territory, and they had the size requirements she already knew about. She called smaller places, farm-to-table restaurants, tasting menu rooms with 8 to 14 seats. Chefs who wrote their menus by hand on a chalkboard and changed them twice a week based on what had come in that morning. She described the fish. Whole, 12 to 16 ounces, dressed weight. Raised in recirculating tanks in Knox County. Live harvested and delivered on ice within 48 hours of order. She said her price, $8.50 per pound, which was above the wholesale rate for larger fish but below what those chefs were paying for comparably sourced striped bass through specialty distributors when they could find it at all. Most of the chefs she called said no, or didn't call back, or said they'd think about it and didn't follow through. She made 37 calls between October 28th and November 19th of 2011. She kept a log of every one of them in a spiral notebook, who she'd called, what they'd said, what the follow-up was. 11 of those calls went to voicemail. 9 said they were happy with their current seafood source. 6 asked questions, and then went quiet. 4 said they'd call her in the spring when they were thinking about menus again. She nearly stopped at the 30-second call. She has said this directly, and without hedging, she almost gave up. Not because she thought the idea was wrong. Because 31 calls with nothing to show for them is a particular kind of tired. And in late November in Maine, the days are short, and the barn gets cold, and the feed bills come in regardless of whether anyone is buying the fish. She sat in the truck in the parking lot of a gas station in Warren, Maine, on a Tuesday afternoon in late November of 2011, and thought about calling Gideon back and asking him what a secondary buyer for undersized fish might pay, and whether she ought to just take the loss and move on. She made the 30-second call instead. The chef on the other end was a woman named Adrienne Bourque, who ran a 14-seat restaurant in Camden called The Ledge, which had been open for 3 years and had built a following among the people who paid attention to where food came from. Adrienne listened to the full description without interrupting. She asked 3 questions. What was the harvest to delivery window? Could Donna guarantee a consistent size band? And what was the minimum order? 48 hours on the harvest window. Yes, on the size band, within a 2-ounce range. Minimum order was 12 fish. Adrienne said she'd take 20 for a Friday. Donna drove to Camden that Friday morning with the fish packed in a 32-quart igloo cooler with 2 layers of crushed ice. 20 whole striped bass, dressed and scaled, running 12 to 15 ounces each. She had packed them herself at 4 a.m. Total weight, 16 pounds, give or take, at $8. 50 per pound, that was $136. It was not a number that changed anything on its own. Adrienne Bourque called on the following Monday morning. She wanted 40 fish for the next Friday. She told Donna, when Donna asked, that she had served them whole and roasted, 1 fish per plate, presented to the table with the head on and the skin crackling. She said the guests had reacted the way guests react when they see something that looks like it came from a specific place and a specific person, rather than from a delivery truck. She said she could not get this fish from anyone else in this size without a special order conversation and a 2-week lead time that made menu planning impractical. She asked if Donna could supply her reliably through the spring. Donna said yes. By March of 2012, she had 8 restaurant accounts in Midcoast, Maine, Adrienne Bourque's 14-seat room in Camden, 2 other chef-driven places in Rockland, a farm-to-table inn outside of Belfast, 4 more she had found through word of mouth that moved, as word of mouth does in a small coastal county, faster than she had expected. She was delivering twice a week, driving the routes herself in her F-250 with the coolers in the bed. By May, she had started a direct-to-household list, home cooks mostly, who had found her through the restaurants or through a small posting she had put on a community board in Thomaston. She was selling whole fish packed in insulated flat-rate boxes with a freeze pack and a card she printed herself with basic cooking instructions and a note about where the fish came from. She shipped twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays to keep the transit time under 48 hours to most of the Northeast. By the end of 2012, her net revenue from what Gideon Marsh had called the grayed-out fraction, the fish nobody in the conventional market had wanted, was $34,000. On fish that the industry standard told her to write off. She had not abandoned the full-size market. The revenue from her market-grade fish, brokered through Gideon, continued. But the margin on the smaller fish was better than the margin on the larger fish, because she had removed every layer of distribution between herself and the person eating the fish. Gideon took 14%. A specialty distributor would have taken 20 to 25. She took nothing, because she was the distributor. The fish that the industry priced as a loss were generating her best margin per pound. In the spring of 2013, she placed her hatchery order and increased the fingerling count to 6,000. She had budgeted a 7% grayed-out rate, roughly 380 undersized fish, based on her previous cohort. And she had buyer commitments for all of them before she placed the order. She was, for the first time, planning backward from the small fish rather than forward from the large ones. Gideon Marsh heard about the direct accounts, the way things surface in a small county, through Pete Soucy at the dock, Who mentioned it to someone at the co-op fuel dock? Who mentioned it to someone Gideon knew? Gideon drove out to Thomaston in October of 2013, looked at the operation, asked careful and specific questions about the recirculating system and the water temperature management and the feed conversion numbers, and told her she was doing something that he had not seen done the way she was doing it. She told him she appreciated that. He asked whether she had considered scaling the grow-out volume. He had buyers in Boston and one in Providence who had been making noise about wanting regional striped bass and were open to sourcing conversations outside their normal channels. She told him she was open to it. They have worked together on the full-size volume since 2014 because Gideon Marsh is a practical man, and practical men adjust. She is 44 years old now. The recirculating system she designed with the University of Maine biologist draws well water at 52 degrees and runs it through a biological filtration loop, nitrifying bacteria on ceramic media, settling chambers, ultraviolet sterilization on the return line. That maintains water quality without chemical intervention and keeps her fish at the temperature range that optimizes their feed conversion ratio through each growth stage. Her fingerling orders now run to $12,000 per year. Her grade out rate has come down to 5% through careful management of tank density and feeding schedules. She sells every fish she grows at prices she sets to a buyer list that she has not advertised publicly in 3 years because she does not need to. The direct-to-household program has 340 active subscribers across 11 states. Restaurants account for about 40% of her revenue. She built neither list quickly. She built both the same way her father built his farmer's market route, one call at a time, one delivery at a time, until the people who had bought from her once told the people they knew. 3 other small aquaculture operators in Maine and one in New Hampshire have reached out to her in the past 4 years, asking how she built her direct accounts. She has talked to all of them. She told them what her father told her, and then she told them that the telling is the easy part. The calls are the hard part. The 31 calls before the 32nd one are the hard part. She told them there was no version of building a buyer list that didn't go through that, and the only question was whether they were going to keep making calls or stop at 31. She does not think about the drive home from Rockland in October of 2011, as often as you might expect. She thinks about her father more than she thinks about that morning on the dock. Warren Ainsworth never saw a recirculating aquaculture system. He never sold a striped bass. He grew vegetables and raised chickens and tended an orchard in Knox County, Maine for 30 years, and he told his youngest daughter too many times to count that the market that doesn't want your product is the wrong market. She heard it so often she stopped hearing it. And then she heard it again on a coast road in October, driving home from a dock, with 400 fish in her tank that nobody wanted. That saying built a 6-figure business. Not quickly, not dramatically, not all at once. The way most real things are built, one call, one cooler, one Friday delivery at a time, until the right market found her, because she had gone looking for it first. And because her father had told her, years before she needed to know, that it was out there. That and 400 fingerlings nobody else would take.